Off our Reimagining Mobility series today with Sara Hendren. We're very excited to have her. I'm going to introduce myself and then provide a few logistics and accessibility notes for us to get us started. So this is Heather Feldner speaking. I'm a cisgendered white woman with short brown hair streaked with gray, dark glasses, wearing a black dress today. I'm sitting in my office at home. There's a window to my right and a light blue wall with my son's drawings on it behind me. I speak with a Midwestern US accent and use she, her pronouns. And I do not identify as disabled, although I am a daughter and a sister of disabled family members, so would describe myself as an ally. And although I study disability technology and accessibility academically, the positionality that I've just described both shapes and limits the perspectives which I bring to these topics. I'm an assistant professor in the rehabilitation medicine program and core faculty in the disability studies program here at UW, and joined by my colleague Kat Steele from mechanical engineering. And this series of seminars is being hosted by Create, which is a center at UW spanning both of our departments, as well as across computer science, electrical engineering, human-centered design and engineering, and the iSchool. And our focus is on research and education and innovation to both make technology more accessible and use technology to make the world more accessible. Before we begin, just again, a few logistical items and accessibility notes. We'll be using microphones during the session, and we have live captioning today, so thank you to Eileen, our captioner. To access the captions, you click on the CC button on your Zoom controls, and you can also view a live transcript. And please message either myself or Kat if you run into any issues. This meeting is being recorded and will be posted afterward, along with a printed transcript. And if you'd like a large print copy, please let Kat or myself know. In terms of self-care, we ask that you do whatever you need to do today to participate and engage in the session. If we were in person, we would invite you to move around, lie down, knit, fidget, take notes, draw, or just listen. And so virtually, we will invite you to do the same, as well as invite you to participate with your video on or off, however you're most comfortable. And just wanted to note that participation today can be demonstrated in a variety of ways, both verbal and nonverbal. And virtually this will occur with using the chat box, either speaking out loud or using the raise hand feature under the participation tab in Zoom. Or you can feel free to communicate asynchronously with us via email or phone. And just as a reminder, we ask to please mute your microphones if you're not speaking verbally. And we also want to recognize that accessibility is an ongoing learning process, and there are often competing accessibility needs. And so this is something that we are constantly learning about and constantly learning from people with lived expertise. And we get it wrong a lot, and that helps us to get it right more in the future. So if you have any accessibility feedback for us today, please also let us know. And so today we're going to be starting with a brief presentation from Sara, and then we're going to be moving on to a question and answer period. And Kat and I are going to be, along with a few of our grad students, thank you, Charlotte and Nicole. We're going to be monitoring the chat, keeping track of questions as we go. So if you have a question, no need to wait until we get to that point in the session. Go ahead and enter your question in the chat box, and we'll make a list of those to delve into after Sara's talk. And we would also, of course, during the session, invite you and would love for you all to ask a question directly via, unmuting yourself and or raising your hand in the participant list. So without further delay, thank you for taking part in our session today. And I'm going to turn over to Kat to introduce Sara to us.
All right, well, it's so fantastic to see you all. I am Kat Steele, and I'm wearing my purple appropriate University of Washington shirt in our rather dark basement this morning. And as we get started this year, we were so excited to see how many people wanted to engage with this Reimagining Mobility series. And we're really hoping that this can be a forum for examining our assumptions about how we move and explore the world, identifying challenges, and celebrating new viewpoints. And so to launch the series, we really could think of no better person than Sara Hendren. Part of reimagining is examining the current state of the world, reframing our viewpoints, and having the courage to try new things. And Sara's work really epitomizes this process. Sara Hendren is an artist, design researcher, writer, and professor at the Olin College of Engineering. Her work spans collaborative public art and social design that engages the human body, technology, and the politics of disability. For those of you who joined the read-along, you saw many examples of her work and her students' work, such as a lectern for short stature or a wheelchair ramp for dancing. But you were also able to see her ability to meld history, design, and inquiry to critically examine our assumptions about human ability. We are so excited to discuss this with her and her broader work. So today, Sara will start off with a brief presentation, followed by our Q&A. And so without further delay, Sara is going to share her screen and we will get started.
Yeah, thank you. So it's really terrific to be here. I'm such a long fan of human-centered engineering folks and UW in particular, and Kat and Heather. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's really fortifying to just find like-minded folks, and I see that there are people here from lots of places. So glad to be here. I just join you in a kind of like-minded pursuit. I am a middle-aged white woman in a pandemic sweats today. I got my red sweatshirt on, and behind me is a big abstract painting by my brother David Hendren and a bookshelf. And I'm glad to be here. I use she/her pronouns, and again, will be most interested in talking with you. I will just share my screen now and talk about, show some images that were not in the book, but that I talk about in the book, and try to just evoke some of the big ideas there, not all of them, but a kind of overview in the hopes of identifying some ideas that I think gather all of us. So you are looking here at the cover of the book, What Can a Body Do? How We Meet the Built World. Kat, just give me a thumbs up that you can see this. Yeah, so the question of the book, and I think for a lot of our work today, is embodied in the design of the jacket, and that is that the type is actually bleeding off the jacket of the book, so the edges of those letters of the title and the author's name are not quite contained by the jacket. And so that's the question of the built world. Is the type too big for the real estate of that book jacket, or is the book too small to contain it? And the unresolve of that question is what drives so much of the engine and the inquiry that I'm interested in, and I know that you are as well. So right, our topic is design and disability, and I think there are lots of ways that people have a go-to notion about what that is that I'm hoping to expand today, and to take up the very theme that's been set out by Kat and Heather so well, to really think about what it is we do when we reimagine, right? That we don't just proceed into novel forms of technology alone, but that we use all kinds of intellectual, affective, highly attentive capacities to think about this otherwise world that might exist, that might alter the status quo. And then secondly, this idea of mobility, which of course in engineering, we tend to think in terms of locomotion, we tend to think in terms of movement, we tend to think in terms perhaps of the body as the node and its extensions, or perhaps of vehicles and wheelchairs and such. But mobility is this very expansive notion of what it means to move through the world, both literally, physically in that pragmatic sense, and then also economic mobility, social mobility, civic mobility, the ways that we thrive and flourish in a civic sense. So I hope that this will demonstrate the widest possible capacity for thinking about both of those terms that I know you all share. So I'm showing you here this image of, what a lot of people think of when they think of design and disability. They think of one of two things. One is this kind of high-tech arm, the myoelectrics or other kinds of super high-end arms, and you're looking at a man with a flesh arm on the right and one of these, high-end myoelectric arms on the left, and the persuasive story that is told about such technologies, including the wedding ring that is on the finger of the prosthetic limb on the left. And so the powerful story of rehab engineering, and lots of times it's a really good one, but the powerful story is that when the tech swoops in, it restores not just functionality in this recognizable sense, but also the sense of identity. And that is a story that can be transformative, and it's one that people tend to tell. The other, and I'm just showing you images here, is the kind of other story that tends to be the go-to story for design and disability, and that is of universal design that shows up in everyday products. So an image here is of the Cuisinart food processor, famously redesigned by Mark Harrison at RISD, the Aeron chair there in the middle, and then the Good Grips tools, the OXO Good Grips line of kitchen tools with their grippy rubber handles. And all of those, probably plenty of you know, have an origin story that begins in the kind of marginal space of disability. And that's the logic of universal design, is such that that insight that comes from the margins then actually gives us an insight about a better ergonomic product for a lot of people. So again, lots of transformative, really interesting products that come from rehab engineering labs in the high-tech sense, and from this logic of universal design. But these, I would suggest, are two stories that live in a vast realm of other kinds of stories about the places where design and disability meet. So I want to just add to those definitions, and to give us this kind of distilled, wondrous look at this plain fact, this deeply human, and indeed salutary fact, that what we're talking about when we talk about design and disability is the human experience of getting help, the universal human experience of getting help. And that a good future, desirable futures, actually have assistance in them. That our task is not actually to design the fact of assistance out of our worlds, but to design toward them in ways that help us to flourish. The desirability of assistance at all scales. Let me just say too, I'm just showing you here the covers of a bunch of books that have come out that precede mine and join mine that in the last several years. So books by Bess Williamson, Elizabeth Guffey, Amy Hemry, and others here. I'm just to indicate to you the richness of this field, and also a lot of ferment around this topic. And so I'm showing you again an image of my book that joins a whole family tree of others that explore these stories. And I'll just tell you some in mine, and you can go to those others for others. And here is a place to think about mobility reimagined at the scale of the prosthesis, which again is the familiar spot, right? So on the left is a man named Mike, who we meet in the limb chapter of my book, who does use one of those myoelectric arms, became an amputee at 14. So this is an image of him, a middle-aged white man using this myoelectric arm on the left and with a flesh arm on the right. And Mike's story is one, again, that we see everywhere in popular culture. Less often we see this image on the right, a man named Chris, who's a 30-something white man who's got a flesh arm on the left and then a residual limb that tapers off under the shoulder on the right. And we're seeing him at the changing table with his newborn baby who's wearing a diaper and who's got a little $10 kind of holster that Chris fashioned himself that will suspend the baby's legs while he changes that diaper. And these stories are about, to drop in on Chris at this incredibly intimate moment. Chris is somebody who does not actually use that universal myoelectric limb. In fact, he was born with one arm, and he has always done life, despite being the recipient of all kinds of prosthetics handed his way. He actually does life mostly one-handed and with the incredibly dexterous use of his feet and toes and so on in 1,000 kind of workarounds. And so Chris was a kind of person who mostly opted out of prosthetics in general, but finds himself as people do, right, in this kind of just-in-time specific kind of use case where just the right prosthesis shows up, this kind of very low-tech, highly bespoke, one-use, single-use prosthesis. And I show these stories not to say one is better or worse, one is sort of plucky and domestic, and the other is at scaled technology, but rather that the body, the deeply adaptive fact of the body is the real story here, that regardless of where the technology arrives, the body is finding its possibilities, shifting its shapes, and seeking its possibilities in all forms. More than that, it demonstrates this idea that Rosemary Garland Thompson, who's one of the kind of senior scholars in disability studies, calls disability, this moment of disability meeting design, as the condition actually of misfitting. So far from being just a story about technology, it's this misfit condition that should really hold our attention and actually launch a whole new set of questions. Misfitting, she says, is the condition of being a square peg in a round hole world. And that sounds kind of commonplace and kind of self-evident. And yet when you think about it, to be a misfit, to be a square peg in a round hole world, the question for designers and engineers is actually not really clear. Why? Because the misfit, the disjuncture, is running between the peg and the hole and back. So it's not clear whether the misfit and then therefore the onus of the kind of problem or the challenge lies on the body, that square peg, or lies, the onus is on the round hole of the world. In other words, this is the social model of disability made plain. When we misfit, when our bodies come up against the rigid shapes of the world, is it that the body is looking for gear and technology to bring it to that world? Or is it that the world might shift and bend its shapes a little bit to come a little bit more toward the body? Neither of those is the right question. It's that all of these questions live in an ecosystem where we ask ourselves, which is the place? What is the site at which we'd intervene? Where is the world asking us to intervene? At which scale and how? And in hardware and software, in low-tech tools and high-tech tools, in people's living rooms and in laboratories, right? It's in lots of places. So that limb chapter goes on to explore a bunch of other kinds of prosthetics too. And I'm showing you here 4 images, one of which is on the lower right, the kind of legacy of rehab engineering, which of course started in World War I and especially after World War II, the big, National Science Foundation dollars that went toward assisting folks with prosthetics, men like this. It's a line of men, soldiers returned from war who are missing limbs and using crutches, standing in a line, sort of returned home without parts, right? And the kind of, so I tell a little bit of the story of that. All of which, again, we benefit from today. But we also travel. In the upper left, you're seeing an image in a Jaipur foot clinic that's in sites all over India. The Jaipur Foot Project, of course, many of you will know, provides, designs, builds, delivers for free low-tech, lower limb prostheses at the scale of 1.5 million now. So that the kind of design and distribution of that and how we think about the impact of that compared to rehab engineering and high-tech engineering in our own field. My goodness, the story gets really rich and complicated there. We also visit Audre Lorde, there's an image of her in the lower left, who was one of our best writers about race and gender and so on, and who wrote a book called The Cancer Journals, in which she talks about tangling at the doctor's office after a mastectomy and being someone like Chris, who actually opted out of the prosthesis, the breast replacement, that actually the doctors and nurses were hoping she would wear in a kind of performance of wholeness after that illness. And Lorde was finding herself alive and in her asymmetrical body and affirmative in her life without prosthetics. How interesting that it was actually, the meaning was also being made and contested and argued over. The nurse really wanted her to wear this thing. And she said, no, I'm good. I'm celebrating in the way that I am. How interesting to negotiate the prosthesis in that way. And finally, a woman named Cindy, who appears in the top, who's a 60-year-old white woman living in the suburbs who became a quadruple amputee at age 60 and built for herself, even having been provided this one of those high-tech universal arms, instead opted for a whole suite of low-tech tools, including this rubber tubing that's helping her to apply eyeliner. What I mean here is that, again, the family of prosthesis, of prosthetics, the mobility that's made possible through these various appendages, the systems that provide them, the decisions we make to opt in and opt out, that is a rich socio-technical sphere. And we miss it if we just think in terms of technical novelty in the lab, or we just think in terms of universal design. So prosthetics, right, are biopolitical. They are both functional and very engineered, and they also live in the social sphere that is never a kind of neutral space. And we might think instead, in this kind of reimagining mobility, about replacement parts for the things that actually matter. And we'd have to know then what matters and to whom and when and where and why, and therefore what's called for. I'm just also showing you, in Cindy's case, this kind of like the things that matter is so poignant and clear. There's a GIF here in the lower part of the frame where Cindy is using the most transformative tool for her. So far from it being that $80,000 arm that she qualified for, This is a little $10 silicone cap that goes over the residual limb of her right hand, which is missing all of its digits and fingers. So it's a cap that fits over this residual limb that doesn't have extensions. And that cap is fitted with a pen, a ballpoint pen, just so. And it makes it possible for Cindy to write in her own handwriting. So Cindy, went to her prosthetist after having qualified for and gotten the training for this incredible, limb, myoelectric limb, again, at great expense, that she was really excited about, but she could not find a way to use it that was not heavy, cumbersome, unwieldy in every way. So it is collecting dust in a closet at Cindy's house. And she went back to her prosthetist and said, I know I don't have to ever write a thank you note again. I mean, speech to text on your phone is really great. You don't have to do this, but she wanted to. The thing that mattered to her was writing a thank you note in her own handwriting, in her own recognizable handwriting that came back to her through this tool. So it's quite remarkable. So, right. The human experience of getting help and in all the ways that it shows up and appears in our lives. So I do, I just want to mention so briefly that I do there's a chapter called Chair where I do look at these universally designed products again. So I'm just showing you again that food processor and so on. And I do try to talk through both the affordances and the limitations of universal design. And we also drop in on a radically bespoke cardboard carpentry workshop that makes chairs. So chair is our subject there, that are utterly unlike the Aeron chair, not at all universal. In fact, they are highly bespoke and made one person at a time. And I talk a little bit about ways to think about scalability and the way that we think about scale as being the only metric for impact, and alternate ways we might think about networked and diffuse design for one in this way. So what we're looking at here is the ADA workshop. So it looks like a workshop with tools and a big wooden table workspace, and a physical therapist and a fabricator and educator are all around a toddler who's, and he's getting this chair built for him, a triple wall cardboard, and it's being measured down to the 1/4 of an inch to make it just so for him. Here's another image of just toddlers and these various aides and fabricators working to make a standing kind of support for a young child, again, out of painted triple wall cardboard, to make this social exchange possible of play. So again, just noting that as a little signpost, I won't go into it. We could look too at architectural scale for this misfitting, kind of imagination of mobility, reinvigorated. This is an image of a lobby at Gallaudet University built on a logic of deaf space. So you're looking at a glossy modern building with concrete floors and wooden benches and long sight lines with these half-height walls. And there are people of different races walking and signing to one another and seated in club chairs and around tables and so on. And the logic of deaf space, you may know, is utterly kind of orthogonal to the idea of fixing hearing, or of imagining that mobility in the world only arrives with cochlear implants. I mean, deaf space is an architecture program built entirely around deafness. So it's entirely made to honor the condition and the integrity and the visuality of sign. So the things like the solid color choices of blues and greens here make for a nice contrast for the delicacy of visual language in sign. Those long sight lines make it possible, of course, to speak with one another in sign across short, medium, and long range distances. But Gallaudet in deaf space is this invitation to think not about hearing as a condition only on the body, but to think about environments that actually make it possible to build a different relationship to sound and a different relationship to sight. So I wanted people to see that kind of like at architectural scale. Sometimes engineers forget to think about environments as well as technologies. In that same chapter, which is called Room, we also go down the street to the signing Starbucks, which is in the neighborhood of Gallaudet, and is nothing more and nothing less than a Starbucks that is staffed by folks behind the counter who are deaf. And I think a lot of people in engineering would be surprised at the utterly really low-tech way in which this service design is completely altering the power dynamics in the public sphere. So when I walked up as a hearing person, I wrote my name down on a wipe away tablet and my order, and I paid in an automated way that one does in retail now, and my name came up on a monitor at the end of the coffee bar. I'm not a signing person. Those folks did not voice to me. We had a perfectly good, friendly exchange in retail, again, with the subtlest kinds of changes that changed everything in that service design. And I think it's really worth thinking about accessibility when it arrives at the scale of services, and also sometimes with less complexity than a lot of people think. We end that chapter of Room looking at with a visit to this man, Steve Sailing, who has advanced ALS. You see him here, a middle-aged white man in a motorized wheelchair in a room that's painted red with lots of pictures on the walls and so on. This is him at his residence, the Sailing residence, which is a nursing home in Chelsea, Massachusetts, here in Boston. And Steve, when he got his diagnosis 12 years ago, understood that he could be looking for cures for ALS, but he could also be thinking in terms of design for the kind of life he wanted to live when his mobility was radically altered. He knew, looking ahead in an anticipatory way, that his daily life would be quite different soon enough. So in the era before smart home technologies were at the big box store and readily available, Steve worked with a philanthropist and nursing home director and software engineers to create an automated home environment for himself and other people with ALS and MS. So from that wheelchair mounted tablet and a tiny cursor that's on the nose bridge of his glasses, he can summon all the elevators and open all the doors and run the HVAC and the media and everything in his room. And in other words, provide a lot of independence with technology. More interesting than that is his mobility that's made possible in an ecosystem of human care in that technology. But Steve, again, he's as busier than he's ever been. He is living with a condition that a lot of people tend not to think of as having a high quality of life. He would want a cure tomorrow, and he also was able to build a life worth living, that a life worth living can also be built and redefined as such. So it's a quite extraordinary story about the way that technology lives in this ecosystem of care. We can also think of at the scale of streets and mobility. Maybe that's a little more near at hand, but a lot of times people think of in urban planning and design, like an image on the right, of the way that guerrilla bike lanes appear to reshape our streets. So that on the right is the side of a street where, with tape and plants and kind of temporary bollards, a bike lane is being carved out in a kind of form of protest to make the street a little bit more amenable to bikes. People tend to think of that as kind of civic activism. Less, I think, visible and memorable in our history is the same kind of activism that gave us the ubiquity of curb cuts. That's what you're looking at on the left. And the guerrilla activism and the heavy lobbying and the just improbable, level of pressure that it took for disabled people to reshape the street one corner at a time. I mean, an inclined plane, right? A simple machine that actually changes everything about getting down the street into public space, which is, of course, the public sphere. And I think it's just a generation ago that this was rolled out at infrastructural scale. So here again, we're at another level out from the node of the body and the prosthesis. We're at the level of cities being made more flexible, more friendly, with just a little edit, one at a time, again, at massive scale. And what a profound civic history that is, and to know that bias can be built, can be packed into even the atomic structure of our environments, and what it takes to reshape them. That street chapter ends with a visit to this dementia village, which is in the Netherlands. And what you're looking at is a locked facility, a nursing home for memory care that is built with streets in it. So you go in through a set of double doors and you see this open plaza and a restaurant and a bar and a gym and a barbershop and so on, and residences. And here the use of architecture is being deployed as treatment. That is, to take the familiarity, the continuity, the highly localized and place-based signals of architectural choices and design to help people who are not just, of course, struggling with memory, but with navigation, to locate themselves in space, to rely less on pharmacology to quell their anxiety, and to keep making those connections with their past. Dehokewake is the name of it. So here's a street design, architectural scale way of treating the body that, again, is not the node of this thing, this one corpus in the form of medicine or wearables or anything else, but instead a kind of reshaping of the environment all around us. So that's what the book kind of goes through at these multiple scales, only to suggest what I think a lot of you in this room know, which is that disability and design show up everywhere. It's the most exciting research area for that reason, and it involves all of us. And I hope that too, we find in reimagining mobility that in fact we locate ourselves in these bodies, no matter their form, in a horizon of a future that includes a desirability of assistance, that a future belongs to all of us when it has help in it, designed, human, engineered, demanded, a politics, a prosthesis when it's called for, etc. So that's what I have in terms of slides. I'm going to stop sharing now and try to open it up for questions that I'll ask. So I think Kat and Heather, are you going to go through and kind of call on people, or?
Yes, so thank you so much, Sarah. It was fantastic to see the images. You know, we really appreciate all of it. It's a great overview. So folks can either, if you'd like to unmute and ask a question, feel free to raise a hand and we'll keep our eyes on that, or you can type a question into the chat. But while we're waiting, I will start with a question. And so you provided so many outstanding examples of how we can take insights from the margin, examine our assumptions, and reimagine our bodies, spaces, and experiences. You mentioned part of the challenge, and especially that you work with your students, is examining where to ask the questions and at what level. And so on this call, we have people working across all these different areas and who might be starting to think, well, how can I apply some of these frames to my own work? Where might you suggest that they start in that process?
Yeah, I think, you know, anthropologists are really our big experts in this way. And I think because they pay such close attention to people in their rich material culture environments, and anthropologists are trained to look at what people are saying, but also what they're not saying, to look at what people are doing, but also what they're not doing, to look at what an environment includes and is present, and also what is absent. So I guess I would say in very practical terms, let's say to somebody who's thinking a lot about accessible transportation, and maybe you're thinking about at the level of the bus or at the level of the subway, I would suggest widening your aperture a little bit from that location. And this is true in terms of like if you're thinking about making eating more accessible or you're making reading more accessible, widen the aperture if you can a little bit and try to ask yourself, what's really trying to be getting done here? Okay, so maybe it's not the bus itself, but about getting where I need to go and the whole ecosystem of the commute, right? So in other words, it just widens the frame a little bit. Or eating is like, okay, well, on the one hand, that's a very, very pragmatic thing of keeping my body alive, but what's all the social meaning around eating? Who's present and who's not? What are the conditions under which eating is taking place? And what are the real values? It's that Cindy moment of like, what are replacing the things that matter? So in other words, if you widen that aperture, Kat, I think you get then your attention then, right? Your antenna can get on high alert for what are all the places where there's like a heat map of meaning, questions, bottlenecks, and that kind of can shake you up from this idea that like, here is a motor challenge. I am going to design for that motor challenge and only for that motor challenge. And I'm only thinking about motors, like in this very narrowly scripted way, and to be thinking in those concentric circles, what matters to this person? Even if you land back at that motor moment, it's taking that anthropological, that deep ethnography of the complicated animal that is the human in its many contexts, right? That's why we can't just send an email with a survey, answer a bunch of yes, no questions. Oh, now we know what to build, right? Life's just a lot messier than that. And why we do the things we do, we're not even fully aware a lot of the time of why we do the things we do. So that it takes that level of attention, I think. And again, this is not like, it's not like you're going to embark on a 6-month process. It just means if you've got a real design partner, show up in the other contexts that are not just the lab, right? Ask to follow them around and shadow them. And you can do this remotely. Anthropologists have been thinking about this for 9 months, how you do it remotely in a pandemic, field work. But even just some of those techniques enhance our design and engineering process infinitely if we're willing to sit with the awkwardness, the uncertainty, the conflicting needs, and so on. It's complicated work.
Thank you so much, Sarah. There was a question and a comment from one of the audience members in reference to the example that you gave with curb cuts and the bike kind of the bike lane on the sidewalk. And this person wrote that, bike lanes can also present challenges for other users, like those who use wheelchairs. And how do you consider these sometimes competing accessibility needs?
Yeah, I mean, that's always going to be a case, right? And we're seeing this certainly where I live in Boston with shared street initiatives and so on. I mean, I think I am for moments of prototyping in lots of ways, and prototyping, right, implies a kind of modesty and pilot programs and a lot of human-centered feedback and so on, and reversibility in the things that we try, right? And I think those bike lanes are actually, that's sort of, people call it tactical urbanism, but I think those are good ideas in the sense that I'm going to provisionally set this stuff up, right? I can take those plants away easily. I can pull up that tape, but I'm going to see what happens and create some data. And I do think that to build a flourishing culture, you need enough social trust to try that out in a reversible and piloted way, instead of trying to arrive at universal good for everyone, which is not possible. It's just not, right? Before you do anything, right? So in other words, I would say you have to take seriously the real constituencies and needs. But I mean, wheelchair access and the textured, what are the texture bumps called, for cane users, blind and low vision folks, even those are at a kind of cross purpose, and those are accessibility provisions. So I find it frustrating when people have this as a kind of gotcha in the conversation, where they go like, well, since there's going to be competing access measures, it's a kind of derailed by complexity. Like, that means we're going to do nothing, or that means this is way too complicated, or that means, see, it's way too expensive. And universal design is an aspiration and a horizon, and it's not meant to be a kind of program, it seems to me, for rolling out your design decisions. I think it is a kind of set of ideas and ideals from which we can, make a city. But remember too, right, if I may say, I mean, a democracy also is not about a lockstep universal agreement. The richness of a democracy is actually pluralistic and indeed agonistic and competing and contested claims that find a way to live together. And I think our common commitment to prototyping, with that reversibility, with that modesty, with that community-centered feedback, is the way that we do build a world that doesn't just in a sclerotic process keep us from doing anything, right? Because we can foresee possible problems. Sorry, Heather, that was maybe more than you asked for, but
No.
I find that I'm quite exercised about this because I saw a lot of naysaying in my own neighborhood about the shared street things, even sometimes on accessibility grounds. I have a son with Down syndrome. I'm aware, like, I'm worried about streets and the way that they change and whether they're going to be clear or not. But I also understand, as a citizen, you have to be able to try. You have to be able to try some things, and then make them reversible in order to actually see if they work. You cannot make a blueprint that you have universal agreement on before you do anything. So it's a thorny issue. I mean, it's hard.
I love those points, and it reminds me so much of when we were thinking about how to design accessible maker spaces. It was all about those prototyping and having the users in there themselves. I remember there were many things in the maker space that the people who use power wheelchairs really wanted, who then the people who were blind or low vision said, well, wait, but they were actually able to come up with solutions together.
That's right.
So
and
now,
I think
okay,
it takes that conviviality and trust, Kat. I mean, I think instead of it being kind of like, well, here's a problem and a problem, it's like that's why prototyping is actually a disposition. Like, people think of prototyping as like a technical thing, like a stage in a technical process. It is that, but it's really a disposition, which is to say, I'm going to try something concrete and I'm going to hold it enough in the provisional that I can undo its seams, and then I can redo what I'm trying to do, and I can undo it again and redo it. But it's like I say to my students, it's commitment and provisionality, commitment and provisionality. And I think a lot of times people get hung up on this kind of like, if I can foresee a possible access problem, I'm going to nix this whole thing. And I think, no, you have to, it's more fluid than that. You got to get in the makerspace and try, and then, right, figure it out.
And so now, thank you, Christy Bjornson from Seattle Children's Hospital. Thank you for unmuting. I believe you had a question as well, so we'll let you take the floor.
Hey, Sarah, thank you so much. You have made my best read of the end of 2020. So thank you so much for that opportunity. It was a fabulous read and I've sent it on. And I also appreciate from a personal perspective, having observed a family member who had a $30,000 upper extremity device. It was the state-of-the-art rehab for him at the time in 1970, which sat in the closet and he never used it. He used a piece of foam on a pen for his 40-year professional career and was quite functional. So I appreciated all of your examples. My question is, as someone who works in training healthcare professionals to go out and work with persons who have a different experience in the world, interacting with the world, is how do we model to them this, what you were just describing, that engage, reformat, come back, take it apart, put it back again. How do we model that to these students, to whether they're OT students, PT students, engineers, prosthetists, et cetera? How do we, as they're teaching and taking this forward, because it isn't a $90,000 bionic arm always. It could be a piece of foam, or it could be a rubber gauntlet, whatever.
Yeah.
My brother used that, the rubber tip of a pencil on a foam to print a newspaper for 45 years. He didn't need anything. It was like that got the job done. So how do we model that, and how do we teach that?
Yeah, I love those examples, and I've of course heard so many like that. And I also want to broadcast, because I know there are folks here who are working in the super high-tech labs at Georgia Tech and places like that. Is not a negation of your work. None of this is about a kind of binary between things.
Exactly.
And I say that as somebody, right, who's watching Steve, sailing, having a transformative experience with quite high technology. I mean, what it means to have ALS for him, I would call that liberatory tech, those, touchscreen interfaces, Apple products, and so on. So, Christy, right, I think, two things. Well, for one thing, I always say the OTs are like the unsung engineers. Like, I find that OTs have this very tinkering, very pragmatic, and very creative, like, oh, look at this. I've got this, I've got a balloon and like a, I'm just gonna squint and go it seems like we're trying to, that is my favorite thing ever, right? And that's what OTs are doing, where they're like, what is trying to get done here? And I find that because it's care work, right, and it's often feminized, they don't get recognized as doing technical work too. That's a whole other. So, but I think two things, right? Trying to help broadcast to students early on that it all counts, all the technology counts. So the eraser end of the pencil is also techne, is also technology, right? And so how big a canopy can you draw that includes the far end of what's coming out of DARPA, and also this thing in your junk drawer, of your desk. And we're going to build a big old house, right? And we're going to say this whole buffet is open to us. And we're going to ask ourselves when and where and how will we know, right? And are we sure, right? From these polarities. And the other thing is that I do think you really can teach. I'm embarking to teach right now, remote. It's quite daunting, but you think you can teach that commitment and provisionality frame. What it is a kind of mental humility, to be honest, and agility, like a deep flexibility about saying, I have this idea. Before I fall completely in love with this idea and then get defensive when people reject it and also don't want anybody to change it, right? I am going to build this thing to the best of its capacity, right? I'm going to put these things together and kind of okay, so I was thinking about this, right? And that's what a sketch model is, what that is. And I'm going to bring this to the meeting and I'm going to say, what might it be? Could it be this? I wonder whether, and I'm going to hold all my comments even in that provisional space, right? And I'm going to welcome it when somebody says, it's not really that. It's not really that. That's not it. It's not there yet. You can teach people, I think, to say, it's not about you and your idea. It's not a referendum on whether you're smart or not. It's your agility. It's really a capacity to flex and bend. Like my husband is a documentary filmmaker, and when he brings a draft of a film to the production crew, he mixes all the sound and he makes it exactly right, as though it could go to air. He knows in that meeting that people are going to completely tear it apart. But the reason why he's good at the job is that he's not thinking those jerks, they're wrong. Like, I'm right about this or whatever. He just goes back to the lab, or he just like, fine. Like your capacity to do that can be learned and can be, I think, honed so that you become super resilient in the face of that. But you do have to have it, I think, made explicit, and to say, this is what's called an iterative process. That means it's not linear where you go, here's a space of possibility, it gets narrower and narrower and narrower and narrower. No, it is a cyclical kind of process where we find some things, we try some things out, oh, we go back to the drawing board, we find, and when you teach it the first time, students are like, I hate this, it's unorganized, and I think maybe you all are, completely misinformed about what's supposed to be going on here. And we go like, really have to trust the process. And once they go through it once, they say like, oh, I see, but it's quite painful in the beginning. And let me just say the other thing, Christy, is that that mental agility and capacity is so important that I want young people who can do that to see themselves as invited to design and engineering. Like, a lot of times the professions invite people, right, who think like, well, I should do this because I'm quite technical. Like, I'm really interested in the inner workings of the systems and the whatever. And I think like, maybe like, if you want to do human-centered design, what you need is this other quality, which is like this tremendous flexibility intellectually to go, is it there yet? Is it not there yet? Like, getting closer, but not so much. I'm going to try to make it the best polished version it can be, and I'm going to be willing to undo it all. So that's a response, but not really an answer exactly, but I hope that helps a little bit.
I appreciate it. I think just the part about that process in the training of all these various professionals that interact with families, and like my brother said, he did not care for his OT early in his rehab, but he said what the OT taught him is what took him forward into his professional career for 40 years, that allowed him to come up with those things that helped him interact with his environment. And it's that process that you just described is what the OT it taught him to do for himself, as well as asking for help, which you talked about. But that's how do we model that to our students?
That agency, right? That sense of agency that like the way things are is not the way they must be. And it's interesting. Alex Truesdell, who is the retired director of Adaptive Design Association, is kind of an OT, right, by training. She said to me, I'll never forget this, there are lots of people in the world who have misfitting bodies and conditions, right? There are also a lot of people in the world who know how to build stuff, lots. She said there are fewer people in the middle who go, this is not okay, and I need a different thing, right? So Christy, you're saying when something really crosses over in that disposition to say, this is not working. This desk I cannot do this chair anymore. Like, a lot of us go like, we get very obedient about, not engineers, but we get very obedient about like what is available or not available. And you're saying when your brother crossed over to that feeling of like, this is not okay, and I am gonna, I'm gonna act, like I'm gonna find the thing. That's actually a rarer quality. Isn't that interesting? It's not just the how to in the building sense, it's the agency to say, it has to be different.
Agency.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you, Christy. And I agree that modeling, and especially in these clinical environments too, thinking like, what is the mood and the expectations and that we want to expect from often day one when we meet with families. Now, switching gears a little bit, Karen Breitmeyer, a Seattle architect, is going to unmute and ask a question now. So Karen, are you there?
I am. Thank you very much. Sarah, I'm very interested in talking in more detail about the difference of approaching this process, assuming that all bodies with disability need to be fixed,
right,
versus the environment shifting to better enable more bodies to be independent. And just as you went through your talk, I really believe that those objects that are effective in universal design approach supporting all bodies in the same, or approach supporting all bodies, period. Mm-hmm. Not we're trying to fix something. And I look at your example, Chris, with his little harness for his son or for his child, and that's not, I don't see that as a workaround. I see that as he has developed a tool that works for him and maybe other people, who knows, And it gets a little bit to what I've talked about a lot in my profession, which is encouraging more people with lived experience with disability to enter the design professions in all aspects, because I think that I think appropriately supported young people who are children who are born with bodies that appear to be different. Many times parents think that the only way to engage with the world is the way they, as parents, engage with the world. And is there an opportunity for the adults that support that child to say, you're going to find your own way to engage with the world, whether that means maybe you choose to use a prosthetic, or maybe you choose to use your own tool or workaround, and give kids the opportunity to try lots of things, and also to have that agency to kind of be their own designer, or to design their environment. And just the last example would be that, sweetie, later, sorry, would be, you know, when you walk into a conference room, typically every conference room there's a chair in every spot around the table, right? That's the way at the end of the day, they clean the room, they put the chairs around the table. Why is it like that? Why do we not walk into a conference room and all the chairs are back against the wall? If you bring your own chair, you can sit anywhere you want. And if you don't bring your own chair, you can pull a chair up, right? So I think it's about turning our perspective on its head and saying, is there another way to think about our environment? So I've blabbed on. I'm really interested in your perspective, Sarah, on that.
Yes, thank you. I mean, +1 to everything you said, Karen, and certainly Gallaudet is living out, those very tensions that you named. I mean, the book is full of people who would identify as disabled, who are building their worlds, right? I wanted you to see Chris, but also to see Steve Sailing, who he himself is the designer at the heart of that. And I wanted, in part, the book to chronicle disabled people remaking their own worlds, so that, right, as you say, more people with disabilities, however they identify, would find themselves in, at UW, for example, in the Access Engineering program and others like it, right? That more folks come to the profession going, oh, there's actually a whole history here. The history of curb cuts, right, is people using wheelchairs demanding a different streetscape. So, and all of that, right, proceeds under a kind of human flourishing model that is not about fixes and cures. It's actually really about making room. It's about flexing the built world to make it more accessible to more people, as you say. And Gallaudet is really interesting because this tension that you named about parents, I mean, something like 15 or 20% of students who arrive at Gallaudet are new to signing, but they are deaf or hard of hearing. And what that means is that they've been mainstreamed in school, and their parents, right, in using their best judgment, right, no shade. I mean, it's just their parents are thinking, what's the best thing I can do that worked for me, as you say, Karen? And it was like, well, I should probably provide them with the most mainstream. They should probably bring their bodies to the world, right? And some of those students, even in defiance of their parents' choices, go to Gallaudet to become signers in a way that feels to them like the way they want to do the world. And I mean, I met a student who got a scholarship and said, sorry, I'm going. She was so happy to switch to sign from having done SEE, sort of signing exact English, or from voicing in her way. And so at Gallaudet, all that stuff is playing out in such a rich and interesting way. And Deaf Space comes from all the tacit knowledge that deaf people have been employing for, centuries to remake their worlds. And it's just giving it a codified formal, design language. So anyway, thank you for those comments.
And just to be respectful of everyone's time, I think those were some excellent closing words, encouraging folks to really flex their environments, flex their products, flex their bodies, considering all these different opportunities. An hour always goes by way too quickly, but I was so excited to get to see this amazing group here today. Please join me in giving a big round of applause thumbs up to Sara for joining us.
Thank you all so much. And thank you for your work. So much amazing, important work happening here.